Good morning. I'm going to come at this from a rather different perspective. My work has been in the field of positive psychology, and my other hat is for the last 46 years I've worked closely with the Tibetan tradition and translating and trying to preserve all the advanced meditation practices of that tradition in Western terms before they all die out. So I'm going to talk about the implications of positive psychology and the contemplative traditions for a model of leadership to move this positive piece forward in the world. The field of positive psychology began about 30 years ago in the West. Some of the basic research questions are: what makes life worth living? Research on performance excellence and vital engagement, on the impact of positive emotions on mental health and well-being, on pro-social behavior like gratitude, forgiveness, altruism, on exceptional human abilities, and research on wisdom. Those are the initiatives in the field of positive psychology. 30 years ago, most of the research, particularly in clinical field, has been on negative states. The ratio of research on negative states to positive states in the psychology field is 17-1. Positive psychology raises questions about what makes life worthwhile, what constitutes the flourishing individual. The three pillars of positive psychology are positive emotions and their impact, positive traits like personality strengths and virtues, and positive institutions. In Buddhist psychology, in the Abhidhamma, or theory of mind, they say something very similar to what you've heard today. That the techniques for working with negative states of mind and the techniques for working with positive states of mind complement each other, but they're not reducible to each other. So the focus on negative piece and positive piece is very similar to this. Western psychology is focused entirely on negative states, particularly in the clinical field. The psychoanalytic or psychodynamic tradition focuses on intrapsychic conflict behaviors and focuses on maladaptive behaviors. Cognitive therapy focuses on negative self-talk and irrational beliefs, and developmental therapy focuses on developmental deficits. There's been very little emphasis on positive psychology, and because of that, there are certain conditions that we've failed to treat successfully because there's no emphasis on the positive. I'm going to give brief illustrations of two of those areas. One is the treatment of attachment disorders in children and adults, and the other is the treatment of self and self-esteem failures. I'm going to focus on 5 different areas of my research: attachment disorders and chronic esteem failure in the clinical field, the research that we've done on post-formal metacognitive development. We've just finished a study on some of the basic gains of long-term meditation. We just did a study on the neurocircuitry of the awakened mind, and we're now going to do a study on the penultimate state, which is pre-enlightened state. And then I'm going to talk about what the implications of that are for training leadership. In the attachment field, we've had 50 years of research showing that there are 4 types of attachment. There's secure attachment. Healthy children, the more they have a secure base with their parents, they explore more, they become more independent. Kids who grow up to be dismissing essentially deactivate the attachment system, and they have sort of pseudo-exploratory behavior. The opposite of that are kids who grow up with what we call anxious preoccupation. They deactivate exploratory behavior and they have kind of clingy attachment behavior. And then kids who grow up disorganized essentially alternate back and forth between clingy attachment behavior and dismissing behavior. Those prototypes of those internal maps for attachment are in place by 18 months. They're well locked in by 20 months. And in 40-year prospective studies, 3/4 of the people will not change that map after that into adulthood, from childhood into adulthood. Part of our research is on what works to change that. The problem with the attachment field is that most of the early treatments were psychoanalytically based. You're not going to solve the problem of human attachment by interpreting resistance to attachment. The absence of a negative is not a positive. So we began to focus on a technique called ideal parent figures. We have the people, the adults and children who have attachment disorders, imagine ideal parent figures who are giving them all the right attachment figures and visualize it again and again and again, and they develop a new positive map. and they operate out of that map, and they get better. The average time is 6 months to about 2 years. These are some of the primary functions of attachment behavior: providing a feeling of safety and protection. Healthy parents are fiercely protective of their kids. Feeling attuning to the child's behavior and attuning to the child's internal world and state of mind particularly. Soothing and reassuring the child. Being openly expressive about the delight in everything the child does and what the child thinks and how the child behaves, and just delightful about the child's being. And the fifth function of attachment is healthy parents are supportive of the child's best self-development. They can comfortable bringing out the child's strongest and best sense of self. We imagine ideal parent figures providing all these right things to children or adults with attachment disorders. We do it over and over again with the visualizations, and it works. This is a study of that we did, an outcome study. We found that if we focused on the positive imagery, we call it positively remapping, after about 6 months to 2 years, we get a complete reorganization of the mind. This is a measure of coherence of transcript or coherence of mind. Low coherence would be under 3, high coherence would be between 7 and 9. And you can see here that all of the subjects in our study went from low coherence to high coherence. They completely reorganized their mind. And the treatment effect size in this study was very, very high. Good at treatment effect size in an outcome study is about 0.8. We got 6.2, it's off the charts. So it works. The focus on the positive works much better than focusing on the negative. This is a study of reflective capacity, or how much capacity they can reflect on their own state of mind and metacognitive skill. And you can see, again, a significant increase by focusing on positive remapping. The reason why the positive remapping is important is because we have many studies that show that there's a strong relationship between dismissing attachment and violence behavior. Studies that show that most batterers have dismissing attachment. Most adolescents who commit forcible rape or have dismissing attachment. So if we learn to treat effectively dismissing attachment down the generations, essentially we're contributing to positive peace and lack of violence. Another area where we've had a blind spot is the focus on self-esteem failure, or what we call narcissistic personality disorders. Healthy self-esteem, I like the definition by Joe Sandler in the Hampstead Clinic in the UK. Healthy esteem is the linking of positive affect to the self-representation. That is, in childhood, children learn to associate their sense of self with positive affect. That's a developmental achievement. So children, older children who have healthy esteem, or adults, when they conjure up a sense of self, they conjure up a sense of self against the backdrop of good feeling. If I conjure up Dan-ness right now, I can feel good about Dan because there's positive feelings associated with Dan. If I had self-esteem failure, I would conjure up no feelings about Dan. And I would probably have the sense that might be high function, but I have the sense of something fundamentally missing in my life. Or I would conjure up mostly negative feelings. The trouble is that you can't correct that by just focusing on traditional psychotherapy methods that focus on understanding early childhood patterns. One of my supervisors was, when I was at Chicago, was Heinz Kohut, one of the founders of the self-psychology movement, and he wrote a classic paper called The Two Analyses of Mr. Z. Mr. Z was allegedly a person who went into psychoanalytic treatment, and all the interpretations were correct, but the interpretations made him feel worse about himself. Because what he needed was to focus on something positive. So he went back allegedly to his analyst and talked about why he needed to have the analyst bring out the positive in his experience, and he got better. We now know that there was no Mr. Z. Kohut was writing about his own personal failure of his own analysis and what he wished would have happened in the field in those days. Based on that, we developed a positive esteem protocol based on positive remapping again. Imagine a scene where you feel especially good about yourself. Enhance the intensity and the duration of the positive affect. Transfer that positive feeling to other scenes in other situations. Then imagine feeling good about yourself in relationships. That's harder. See if you can generate that good feeling and hold it for longer duration. Generate it more frequently. Generate it more immediately. And then we give them the actual task of doing the visualizations in their daily life and maintaining the positive feelings about themselves for longer and longer periods of time. And when they could get to the point that they could hold a good feeling more than not in their daily life, they resolve their chronic self-esteem failures. The average time, again, is about 6 months to 2 years, again, focusing on just the positive. A third area I want to talk about is that we've tried to look at the issue of human mature post-formal development. Piaget put forth the standard model of stages of intellectual development in children, but he stopped with adolescence. Some people have focused on developing and mapping out stages of post-formal development beyond adolescence. If we're to thinking that human development and intelligence stops with adolescence, we're in trouble. So we've mapped out 7 post-formal stages of cognitive development, and I don't want to make this too complicated. It's a rather simple point. With each stage shift in the level of post-formal development, you take on a larger and larger perspective. You move beyond relativism to an integrated model of the world. You move beyond systems to super systems. In each perspective is more inclusive than the previous one. And that has profound implications for mental health and for leadership. I want to talk a little bit about the work of Bob Emmons in a book which I think is important for this group. It's called The Psychology of Ultimate Concerns. And what he found was that if people have a larger perspective in their life, usually a vision which is humanitarian or mostly spiritual or civic, but they can look at the larger picture in life, and they think from that larger perspective that we're all interconnected, that from that perspective, that has profound implications for mental health. So the larger and more inclusive the perspective is, the more you see everyone is interconnected within that perspective, the more profound the implications for mental health. As Bob Emmons says, it's the strongest predictor of well-being. We have meaningfulness in the face of suffering. We can be resilient in the face of extreme stress. There's less little internal conflicts within the system. We integrate the personality better. And everything about our life becomes sanctified under this larger spiritual vision. Work isn't work, work is a calling. Intimacy is a sacred bond. Talents are sacred gifts that we have an obligation to manifest in the best way for humanity. I do a lot of work in performance excellence training in the medical school, and I do a course for judges. And one of the exercises that always works with the judges is to get them to imagine why they're doing what they're doing. What's the larger vision? And it's usually some humanitarian vision or civic vision of why they're doing the work they do. And if we find that they can operate out of that larger vision, they're much more resilient on the bench, and they're much less bored in their work. So I do another course on that for surgeons and for primary care docs. And if primary care docs have 12 minutes with a patient these days. It's like assembly line work. But if we can get them to access why they went to medical school in the first place, and the work is ultimately a calling, then once they affirm that calling and they see the larger vision of what they're doing, they're much more resilient in the face of that stress and assembly line approach. Ultimately, if life is operating out of that larger vision, then life is more meaningful, and everything in your life is what we call vital engagement. This is the work of Genie Nakamura. The optimal outcome of human development is life characterized by the conjunction of enjoyment and meaning in one's endeavors. An experience that holds one person to participate in the world, yet holds little subjective significance, it may be absorbing, but it's not vital engagement. Vital engagement is the extent to which they hold meaning for the individual. The larger the view you have of life, the more meaningful it is, the more you live life fully, and everything about your life is one of vital engagement. Now, I want to switch goals here, purposes here, and talk a little bit about the contemplative traditions, because I'm not interested so much in studying meditation, but what the outcomes of meditation are. And the outcomes of meditation, the heart essence of meditation in the Tibetan tradition would be the experience of awakening, or beyond that, an experience that we call sangye. In Tibetan, it means that the absence of all negative states and the flourishing of all positive states. So recently we just conducted a study on the neurocircuitry of awakening, and we actually came up with successful markers of the awakened mind. The awakened mind is a vast, limitless perspective where everyone is interconnected, and you view the world compassionately, and you have a deep concern for what you pass down generatively down the generations. So the markers of that turn out to be, when they're holding that larger view, they activate the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the concentration part of the brain, which means they can hold a larger view and they can hold it very stably and steadily. But the most interesting finding is we found that The area of the brain that gets most activated during awakening is a part of the parietal system that shifts from local to globalized awareness. And in both of those regions of interest, we found high gamma activity, which is very rare, which means all the cells are firing and they're all firing synchronistically. So awake means awake. And this is trainable. We're now working on developing feedback, neurofeedback for the awakened mind. The overall path of meditation, there are three maps here. One is the beginning stages of meditation up to initial experience of awakening, how to stabilize awakening, and the third is called the path of liberation, where you set up a certain view where everything in your experience passes through very quickly without mental engagement. Mental engagement is what causes karmic memory traces to form. So if you set up this view in a certain practice, automatically you release all previous karmic memory traces. The average time is about 6 to 7 years. And then there are no negative states left. Imagine the experience of mind and the implications of mental health for practitioners who have no negative states left in the complete absence of aggression. And because the negative states match the positive states, there's a flourishing of 80 positive states of mind. We've now just been got the grant money approved to do the Neurocircuitry of Sangye, the purified mind, flourishing mind, to look at what happens. We think what we're going to find is activation in the medial orbital prefrontal cortex, which is the positive emotion center of the brain, and the prosocial will be part of the brain. So people who evolve along this spiritual practice actually evolve because they have no negative states left and only positive states, and they think in terms of what they pass on to future generations, and they think in terms of the positivity of what they leave behind them all around in their lives. This, I think, leads to a model for leadership that needs to be considered. I call it the realized leader. That a realized leader is somebody who has evolved themselves in terms of their attachment behavior and their capacity for closeness to others. David McClellan years ago said there were two kinds of people in his research. There were people who were naturally affiliatory motivated and people who were power-oriented, and they didn't get along very well. Unfortunately, the affiliatory people do much better as leaders, but they're not interested in being leaders because they're not interested in power. And the people who are power-oriented want to be leaders, but they don't care, they're not interested in people, so they make decisions that affect people negatively. So we're not training the right group of people to be leaders. We need to train affiliatory people, treat their attachment needs, treat their needs for affiliation, so they have a strong affiliatory base and can be strong leaders. Secondly, we can develop a model of leadership where people have a strong sense of self, but little selfishness. If you look at the larger vision of life, then there's no place for selfish interests and concerns. Or as somebody sent me a cartoon that said, "I finally looked at the big picture in life. I wasn't in it." Or if you learn anything from the spiritual traditions, it's that self-importance isn't terribly important. You have to move beyond that. Finally, most great leaders have a larger vision of life. They have a larger spiritual and humanitarian vision. Steve mentioned Gandhi, for example, as an example of that. They have the capacity to take perspective. They can look at the larger interconnectedness of all people, and they think in terms of what they want to pass on to future generations, not just to what they're going to make this generation. We found that in our research with the meditators that they have remarkable capacity to sustain concentration. The average person spends 48% of their day in mind-wandering mode. Once you train the mind, the meditator spends 0% in mind-wandering mode. This is all trainable. And they have stable awakening, and therefore they have a compassionate view of the world. Imagine that we could develop a training program for this kind of leader to carry forth the world. We can now do that. We have the technology to do that. And that's what our next plan is to do, to try and train realized leaders. It's rather an old idea. It's the old idea of the enlightened king or the philosophy king, that we need to come back to that. I decided to emphasize this weird stuff today because I thought that in hearing Steve's work, which I have a great deal of respect for, that one of the things that's not emphasized enough in the work is what kind of leaders are going to implement his model. So I'm at least trying to raise the question for you today, that this is something that we need to look more at and how to train the right kind of leaders to do this. So I'll stop with that.
Positive Peace Index, so that we would be talking about personal peacefulness, engaged, peaceful caring, all of the factors that make the other factors enhance?
I don't know if how much you want to individualize it, but I think that implied in the category about government, I think that you could flesh out that category and either add a new category or develop that category more around the kind of model of leadership or the vision of leadership. I think that just needs to be done.
It would seem if we assess the individual, we would get more information.
Yeah, well, we have tools to do that, for example. Like one of the things we're doing at the moment is that there's a thing called the Values in Action questionnaire, the VAI, developed at the University of Penn. And it's a measure of 24 signature character strengths. And we're trying to do a study with measuring character strength in judges. I work a lot with judges. And we win either way. If the judges turn out to be more virtuous than lawyers, then we can argue that we ought to do virtue training and character strength training in law school. If the judges turn out to be not as virtuous, then we can make the same argument. Or whatever the data shows, we're trying to see if we can develop character strength and virtue training as part of law school curriculums.
Are there any differences, did you see any differences in your work, either by gender or race or other kind of background? Are there differences when you look at this approach and such in that way?
Not in the studies on the advanced contemplatives. In fact, in the Tibetan tradition, there are as many women masters as men masters. And that's, we're trying to not only preserve the boy tradition, but the girl tradition. We're at the monastery that I'm rebuilding, we put a lot of money into the nunnery, and the girls get the same training as the boys now. They get 14 years of studies and then 3 years of contemplative studies, and we're trying to bring back both the girls and the boy tradition.
The name of that book, The
Psychology of Ultimate Concerns.
Ultimate Concern.
By Bob Emmons, E-M-M-O-N-S. And it shows that the people who can articulate to themselves a larger guiding purpose, which is often spiritual, then they are more resilient, they are happier, they have better well-being, they have more meaningfulness in their life, and they're just more well-rounded, and they get done things much more effectively. So it's a good study. The gist of all the study on post-formal development is the larger your perspective and more inclusive it is, the better the implications for mental health and leadership. That's the simplest message I can give you.
And what was that values index?
It's called the Values in, just Google VIA, Values in Action. You can go onto the website by Marty Seligman's website at the University of Pennsylvania. You can take it yourself. It doesn't cost anything to take. And it will give you a feedback of what your best 3 or 4 character strengths are and what your 3 or 4 worst ones are, what your weaknesses are. Then you can do certain exercises to improve the ones that you're not strong in. Well, one of the things we're working on at the moment is that I'm just finishing a book on training kids in concentration, because kids don't learn to pay attention anymore. And it's rapidly deteriorated. So we have a program in the public school and the private school for adapted for developmental age, for training kids at 4 to 6 years of age, 6 to 8, 8 to 12, and then adolescence.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Reem Ghanem, the AD for the Rotarian Action Group for Peace. I am very intrigued by your highlighting the leadership importance for advancing peace. From my experience as a Palestinian growing up in Palestine, leadership has been related to peace. And in a way, the society was reacted to that in a negative way, because the leaders who embraced peace or were related to peace harmed them. To be more specific, Peace Nobel laureates were politicians. So I wonder, is there an explanation or there is research that shows leadership relation to certain concepts may affect the followers of those leaders and those causes?
I don't know that, but it's the kind of work that could be done by Steve's program. You're the one with the statistics here. I'm just trying to raise the question because I think it's important to consider. Whether countries move forward in a positive way or not, a lot of it comes down to leadership. We know that, and we know that in terms of business, for example. There's trickle down from what the flaws or the better qualities of the executives are. I just did a course this weekend for the Brain Trust in Silicon Valley, and what was shocking to me is when I did the exercise on the larger vision of life, almost none of them understood it. We need to develop that. But they agreed with me that they need to develop it. Thank you.